First off, I had to say this at some point during the videos. I found out a week or two ago, well, not 2 weeks, between a week and 2 weeks ago, that instead of having until basically early to mid-June, I would have until the week ending on Friday, May 22nd. Therefore, where I thought I was ahead of the game, or at least right on time in terms of the curriculum I was delivering, I just lost over 3 weeks of instruction time. As a result, I am having to summarize and speed up my story of the Western world and the planet after the Second World War. I am not happy about this, but it is what it is, and as coronavirus, Chinese Communist Party pandemic woes go, this isn't too bad. So, understand, I'm going quick. Try to keep up. And I'll do my best not to forget anything too critical for the sake of brevity. First off, to indicate a change. As the Potsdam Conference was coming up, after the defeat of Germany, but before the dropping of the atom bombs and the defeat of Japan, the British people were going to the polls. Churchill had been their prime minister since 1940, just before the German attack into France. And as the war was winding up, his personal popularity was very high, not only in Britain, but around the world. He could have gotten easily elected to office here in the United States. But the British people, in the midst of the conference, chose the Socialist or Labour Party candidate, Clement Attlee. They chose the Labour Party, and the Labour Party had chosen Clement Attlee to be their leader. So the magnificent and towering titan that was Churchill was replaced in the middle of the conference by a very smart, very able, clerkish-looking fellow with a bald head and a mustache and eyeglasses, who did not impress Stalin at all. Now, Potsdam already had a change in leaders from the previous meetings of the Big Three because Roosevelt had died and Truman took over as President of the United States. But the election in Britain was a sea change. I think had they been able to retain Churchill as Prime Minister but have the Labour Party run Parliament, the British might have split the difference, but they didn't. The system that they have is whoever controls the parliament controls the executive. There is no strong separation between executive and legislative in the British system. And the Labour Party was about building a, quote, new Jerusalem, a society that was a social welfare state that would give everyone a basic standard of living. And the national health system that was devised during World War II became something that they built on as the centerpiece of their program, that all Brits were going to have access to health care, and that it would be rationed like any other government service, but that nobody would have to pay for it. You just sign up and you wait your turn in line. Sometimes the lines are very long, and you get what treatment they're able to offer. And that became the motto for all sorts of things. But that indicates a real change in priorities. Before the defeat of Japan, Britain was already looking forward to a new type of destiny, not a destiny that defined itself as the British Empire in the wider world, but this is the fruition of a lot of Little Englander, William Gladstone dreams from the 19th century, combined with labor union socialism. It's just a different focus. And it indicates the change of mind and the change of heart that was coming over Western Europe after the war. And Britain, because it was a victorious power, experienced it first. The Cold War runs from 1944 until arguably somewhere in 1993, after the fall of the Soviet Union, as the modern Russia is building. Now, most historians would say 1944? What do you mean? Didn't it start after the war? Or actually, they would assert it did start after the war. Wrong. The Russian response to the Warsaw Uprising of 1944 has nothing to do with fighting the Germans or beating Hitler or any of that. The cessation of the Russian army's movements on the eastern shore of the Vistula River, as the Germans took weeks of time to batter the Polish national underground movement into oblivion, had everything to do with the Soviets and the Germans having a common interest in decapitating Poland. And they did so. Between the German takeover in western Poland and central Poland and the Soviet takeover in eastern Poland, you have the systematic destruction of all Polish intellectuals, college professors, school teachers, engineers, architects, military officers, political leaders, labor leaders, religious leaders. Poland suffered the Katyn Forest massacre in the Russian zone and a systematic moving of people to concentration camps in the German zone. Both of them had the same desire for Poland to be a peasant society working for their betters. Whether their betters are Russians or Germans didn't matter. And there were Polish collaborators who helped the Nazis in the German zone and Polish communists who helped the Russians in the Russian zone. And this played out as the war played out. So the first overt act of the Cold War, that had more to do with communism taking over the world and less to do with beating Hitler, was the Soviet response to the Warsaw Uprising of '44, including their refusal to allow Westerners to bomb the German positions around Warsaw, land and refuel with their allies, supposedly, in the Russian zone, and then fly back and get more bombs. So that really is when the Cold War begins. Now, as the Soviet army moves into the center of Europe, there is what Churchill calls the descending of an iron curtain across Europe. And we'll talk about that very image and that very speech in a moment. Here we have basically a map of post-war Europe up through the end of the Cold War. And it's divided broadly into two zones. A western zone that had been liberated by the Western Allies, the United States and Britain, and the eastern zone, which had been liberated by the Soviets and their allies. Now, there are some neutral areas in between, which we'll talk about. Sweden had been neutral during the war, so had Switzerland. They remained neutral after the war. Finland, even though it had fought Russia in two wars, was Finlandized. What that meant was that Finland elected a pro-Soviet government that wanted independence for Finland, but would never propose any kind of threat to Russia, and the Russians agreed. They had been bloodied by the Finns, and they didn't want to deal with another bloodbath that could go on with guerrilla fighting. They already had a bunch of guerrilla fighting in the newly conquered areas of the Baltic states, and so forth. So Finland was left to be independent so long as it was neutered, and it was. Austria became a neutral zone too. It had, like Germany, been split, but the Russians, in one of their rare moves of conciliation, pulled back from Austria into Czechoslovakia and Hungary, and the West pulled back as well, so Austria was also neutral. Yugoslavia is an interesting case. Yugoslavia was not liberated by the Red Army. No, it was liberated by their own partisans, who were a bunch of communist guerrilla fighters who were very effective. And their leader was Josip Broz Tito, Marshal Tito. And while Marshal Tito was a hardcore communist, Stalinist-style communist, Tito did not want to be dominated by Moscow. And so what was allowed to happen was that Tito, so long as he retained the hard party line of communism, was allowed to break away from the Soviet sphere of influence in terms of military cooperation. Because Tito didn't want the Red Army in Yugoslavia, because he knew what would happen, which is the same thing that happens when the fluffy little mammal jumps on the snake to swim across the river. And the snake bites the cute little mammal in the middle of the river, and as they're both about to drown, the cute little mammal says, "Why?" And the snake says, "It's in my nature." Well, that's the way the Soviets are. They gobble where they are. So Western Europe and Eastern Europe are split, and Churchill refers to this as the Iron Curtain descending. And it was, well, I'll talk about that speech in context. Now, I'll talk about it now. Americans, particularly, but people throughout the world, wanted things to end up peaceful. They wanted a world at peace. They had just been through the worst calamity in human history. They wanted peace. But in fact, the Soviets were aggressively taking over Eastern Europe, and they were using their communist parties in the West to destabilize Western countries in hopes of taking over Western Europe as well. In other words, they were going to expand as far as they possibly could, hopefully short of starting a Third World War. But most people wanted to play ostrich about this. Nem, 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 nem. My head's in the sand. Nem, 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 nem. I can hear no evil, see no evil, speak no evil. So there is no evil. Unfortunately, that isn't the way the world works. And Churchill, who had been defeated by the British, was still very popular in the United States. And he toured the United States in early 1946 as President Harry Truman's guest. They went to a University of Missouri campus in Fulton. And there, Churchill famously says, "From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste on the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across Europe. And behind that curtain are the storied capitals of the ancient Central European powers." Churchill sketches out the differences between the free world and communism, and awakens, or tries to awaken, the American people to the absolutely vital reality that the Soviets were on the warpath. They were expanding, and they were going to do everything they could to destabilize outside of the communist sphere in order to expand the communist sphere. Starvation could do that, and so could political strife. And they had agents well placed in the American bureaucracy too, which is something that will come out. After the war, Attlee's Britain is broke. The United States foolishly pulls the financial rug out from under the British. The United States was supporting the economy of Britain. Britain's economy had collapsed, or would have collapsed during the war if it hadn't been for us. But the moment that Japan was defeated, Congress begins a very rapid process of cutting off aid. And suddenly the British economy is like a person in a Roadrunner cartoon, like Wile E. Coyote standing on a cliff, and all of a sudden, the cliff falls, and Coyote's looking around, and he realizes if he doesn't look down, he's not going to fall, but he can't help it. He has to look down, and then, and that's Britain's economy after World War II. John Maynard Keynes, the great author of macroeconomics and mixed economies, planned economies that are still somewhat capitalist, goes to Washington and says to the American Congress, you know, we fought the Germans for years while you guys just sent us aid. You owe us. To which the Americans came back with the old bromide. If it wasn't for us, you'd be the smallest province in the German Empire. We saved you. So the American Congress did not want to hear Keynes's arguments that Britain had carried the ball, which it did, for years while Americans tried to stay out of the war but prevent Nazi takeover. As it turned out, Britain institutes bread rationing in 1947, something they never had to do during World War II. They rationed everything else, but not bread. You could get as much bread as you could get. Well, not anymore. Everything in Britain is rationing. In other words, the living standard has actually gone down since World War II. So, Britain, we'll see how emblematic Britain's case of financial collapse is as compared to the rest of Europe.